The batwing doors of the dusty Spur saloon swung open with a tired groan, admitting a sliver of the blinding Arizona sun and a man who seemed to be made of the dust it illuminated. He was of medium height, with shoulders that spoke of hard labor rather than brawling. His clothes, a threadbare flannel shirt and worn denim pants, were caked with the ochre-colored dirt of the trail. He moved with a quiet economy, his worn-out boots making little sound on the grimy floorboards as he made his way to a secluded corner of the bar. He didn't look for trouble. In fact, he seemed to actively shrink from the boisterous energy of the room. The saloon was a hive of noise and sweat. Prospectors, cowboys, and drifters crowded the tables, their voices a low roar punctuated by the sharp clink of glasses and sporadic bursts of laughter. A haze of cheap cigar smoke hung in the air, thick enough to taste. The man, who gave his name to the bartender as simply Eli, ordered a water, a request that earned him a skeptical glance. He paid with a small, worn coin and turned his back to the room, nursing the glass as if it held all the comfort in the world. His peace was short-lived. A shadow fell over him, followed by a voice thick with whiskey and arrogance. "Well, look what the dust devil blew in. You lost, little lamb." Eli didn't turn immediately. He took a slow sip of water, his eyes catching the reflection of the man in the mirror behind the bar. He was big, with a cruel twist to his lips and a gun belt slung low on his hips. This was Blackjack Brody, a man who ran his cattle outfit with an iron fist and treated the town of Redemption Gulch as his personal playground. Two of his cronies flanked him, grinning like hyenas. "Just passing through," Eli said, his voice low and even, betraying no hint of fear or anger. Brody chuckled, a harsh, grating sound. "Passing through? You look more like you were run out. A man who orders water in a saloon is either a coward or a preacher, and you ain't wearing a collar." He slapped the bar, making Eli's glass jump. "Thing is, my boys and I are thirsty and the bartender's busy. You look like you know how to serve." The implication was clear and insulting. It was a power play, meant to humiliate. The surrounding conversations began to die down as patrons turned to watch the brewing confrontation. From a table in the far corner, Sheriff Miller, a man whose weary face was etched with the lines of too many such standoffs, watched over the rim of his coffee cup. He saw a common drifter being hassled by a local tyrant, a familiar story he was in no hurry to interrupt. Eli slowly placed his glass on the bar. He could feel the weight of every eye in the room. His hands, calloused and sun-beaten, rested on the wooden countertop. They were steady. "I'm not a bartender," he stated simply. "You are today," Brody snarled, grabbing Eli's arm. The grip was like iron. "Get behind this bar and pour, or my boys will pour you into the street." The crowd murmured, a mix of amusement and nervous tension. Forcing a man to serve you was a profound act of emasculation. Eli's eyes, a pale, washed-out blue, finally met Brody's in the mirror. There was no fear in them, only a chilling stillness, a quiet calculation that went unnoticed by the drunken bully. With a barely perceptible sigh, Eli allowed himself to be pushed toward the gap at the end of the bar. He moved without resistance, his compliance drawing snickers from Brody's men. To everyone in the dusty Spur saloon, it was settled. The quiet ranch hand had been broken. Eli's hand was steady as it closed around the neck of the whiskey bottle. The glass was cool against his calloused skin, a stark contrast to the stuffy, heated air of the saloon, thick with the smell of sweat, stale beer, and fear. He ignored the snickers from Brody's men, Jeb and Coulter, as he moved with an economy of motion that spoke not of servitude, but of discipline. He placed 3 glasses on the worn, scarred wood of the bar. The clink of glass on wood, a sharp, solitary sound in the momentary hush. He poured the first measure for Brody. The amber liquid swirled into the glass, a perfect shot. He didn't spill a drop. His movements were precise, deliberate, as if he were sighting a rifle rather than serving a drink. He slid the glass down the bar, and Brody caught it with a sneer. "Look at that," Brody boomed, holding the glass up for all to see. "He's got a gentle touch. Maybe we should have put you in the cat house instead of behind the bar, old man." The men roared, their laughter a vulgar, echoing wave. Eli's expression remained unchanged. He simply moved to the next glass. From his corner table, Sheriff Miller shifted uncomfortably in his chair. He took a long swallow of his own lukewarm beer, the taste turning sour in his mouth. He could feel the eyes of the other patrons on him, pleading, questioning. He avoided their gaze, focusing instead on a crack in the ceiling. It's just Brody letting off steam, he told himself, the familiar excuse a worn-out blanket against the chill of his own cowardice. Step in, and he'll just make life harder for everyone. He owns the biggest ranch, holds the town's debt. A little roughhousing is better than Brody deciding to call in his markers. He knew it was weak, but it was the logic that had kept him alive and employed for the past 5 years. It was the logic of survival in Redemption Gulch. Eli finished pouring the last drink and set the bottle down with a soft thud. He stood straight, his hands resting lightly on the edge of the bar, his gaze fixed on the space between Brody's men. He didn't look defeated. He looked patient, like a man waiting for a train that he knew, with absolute certainty, would arrive on time. This infuriating calm seemed to gall Brody more than any protest would have. He wanted a reaction. He needed to see the man break. "You know," Brody said, leaning forward on the bar, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial growl. "A good servant always makes sure his master's drink is perfect." He took a theatrical sip of his whiskey, then grimaced. "Tastes like dirt, just like you smell, ranch hand." Before Eli could react, Brody lunged forward, not with a punch, but with a clumsy, intentional stumble. He slammed his arm against his own glass, sending the full measure of whiskey splashing across the front of Eli's worn duster coat. The dark fabric instantly turned a deeper shade of brown, the sharp scent of alcohol cutting through the air. "Whoops," Brody drawled, a cruel grin spreading across his face. "Slippery hands." Jeb and Coulter howled with glee. The humiliation was complete. The stranger was not only their servant, but now a mess of their own making. Eli looked down at the dark stain spreading across his chest. He didn't flinch. Slowly, he reached up with his left hand to brush at the dampness. The simple, reflexive movement pulled the right side of his coat open for a fraction of a second. It was nothing, a barely perceptible shift in the fabric. But Sheriff Miller saw it. From his vantage point, the lamplight caught something under the coat. It wasn't a gun's metallic sheen or a buckle. It was a flash of polished silver, intricately shaped. A star. It was gone as quickly as it appeared, hidden again by the fall of the duster. Miller froze, his beer halfway to his lips. He blinked, wondering if the cheap whiskey had finally made him see things. He looked back at the ranch hand. The man's posture was the same, his face a mask of placid indifference. But the sheriff saw it now. The stillness wasn't submission. It was the deadly calm of a coiled rattlesnake, and Miller suddenly realized, with a lurching in his gut, that he'd been watching the wrong man all along. The drop of whiskey sliding off the hem of Eli's coat seemed to hang in the air for an eternity, a single moment stretched thin by the weight of Sheriff Miller's discovery. His heart hammered against his ribs. A badge. It was a federal badge. The thought was a panicked shout in the silence of his mind. He looked from Eli's stoic, dripping form to Brody's sneering face, and a cold sweat broke out on his neck. He had done nothing. He had let a local tyrant humiliate a U.S. Marshal. Brody, oblivious, savored his perceived victory. His laughter boomed, a coarse, ugly sound that filled the saloon. "Look at him, boys. Can't even hold his liquor for us," he jeered, gesturing to Eli with his empty glass. "Maybe you're not cut out for serving. Maybe you're better suited for work on your knees." He took a deliberate step forward, closing the space between them until he loomed over Eli. The air crackled with menace. "My boots are a bit dusty from the road. Why don't you clean them? Use your sleeve, the wet one." An audible gasp rippled through the onlookers. This was no longer simple hazing, it was a demand of utter subjugation. Even Brody's men shifted uncomfortably. For the first time, Eli lifted his head, his gaze rising from the floor to lock directly with Brody's. The pale blue eyes were no longer vacant or submissive. They were chips of ice, sharp and dangerously focused. The room's temperature seemed to plummet. "No," Eli said. The word was soft, almost a whisper, yet it cut through the saloon's thick air like a razor. It held no defiance, no anger, only the calm, unshakable finality of a closing door. Brody's face darkened with rage. "What did you say to me, you?" He never finished the sentence. With a slow, almost lazy motion, Eli reached inside his soaked duster. It wasn't the quick, desperate movement of a man reaching for a hidden weapon. It was methodical, deliberate. He hooked a thumb behind his lapel and pulled the coat open. There, pinned to his simple wool vest, was the source of Sheriff Miller's dread. A 5-pointed silver star, gleaming under the warm lantern light. It wasn't just a badge. It was an emblem of absolute, undeniable authority. The words U.S. Marshal were clearly stamped into the metal. The silence that fell was profound, heavier and more complete than before. Brody's cronies froze, their smirks vanishing, replaced by wide-eyed shock. The bartender's hand, midway through wiping a glass, stopped moving. Every patron in the dusty Spur saloon stared, a collective intake of breath the only sound. "Marshal Eli Vance," he announced, his voice now imbued with a hard, resonant authority that seemed to come from the very floorboards. He let his gaze sweep over Brody's stunned men before settling back on their leader. "Bartholomew Blackjack Brody, you're under arrest, you and your men, for cattle rustling, intimidation of federal officers, and conspiracy to defraud the United States government." Brody's jaw worked, but no sound came out. The blood drained from his face, leaving behind a mask of pure disbelief that was slowly hardening into fury. He looked from the star to Eli's face, as if unable to reconcile the dusty ranch hand with the federal lawman standing before him. Across the room, Sheriff Miller slowly got to his feet, the legs of his chair scraping a screech of protest against the wooden floor. The sound was deafening in the stillness. Shame burned in his gut, hot and acidic. He wasn't just a bystander. He was an accomplice to this mockery of the law he had sworn to uphold. He had failed his office, his town, and the man now holding the saloon in a grip of silent, cold power. "Marshal," Brody finally choked out, his voice a ragged whisper of contempt. He forced a harsh laugh. "You think some cheap tin star is going to scare me? This is my town." He puffed out his chest, a bull reasserting its dominance, but the tremor in his voice betrayed him. Eli's expression remained unchanged. His hand moved from his lapel, coming to rest calmly on the worn leather grip of the pistol at his hip. "It was never your town, Brody," he said, his voice dangerously low. "You just rented it for a while, and your lease is up." The silence in the dusty Spur was a physical thing, thick and heavy like the dust motes hanging in the air. For a long, stretched moment, the only sound was the slow drip of whiskey from the bar onto the floorboards. A steady, rhythmic reminder of the humiliation that had just been turned on its head. Blackjack Brody's face, which had been a mask of smug amusement, was now a thunderous canvas of disbelief and pure, unadulterated rage. His knuckles were white where he gripped the edge of the bar. "A marshal," Brody finally spat, the words laced with venom. He let out a harsh, disbelieving laugh that held no humor. "You think that tin star makes you something. In this town, I am the law." He took a half step forward, his massive frame radiating menace. "Now, you're going to put that little toy away before you get hurt." Eli didn't flinch. His gaze, cold and steady as a winter river, remained locked on Brody. "The last man who called my badge a toy is buried in a nameless grave outside of Wichita. Your authority, Mr. Brody, ends at your property line. Mine ends where federal law says it does. And right now," he said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous tone, "it says you and your men are coming with me." That was the final spark. Brody's face contorted, and his eyes flickered to his two men, a silent command passing between them. He thought Eli was focused solely on him. It was a fatal miscalculation. As Brody's hand darted towards the Colt Peacemaker holstered at his hip, a blur of motion erupted from the man he had dismissed as a simple ranch hand. It wasn't a wild draw. It was a fluid, economical movement of terrifying efficiency. Before Brody's fingers could even touch the handle of his gun, Eli's own revolver was in his hand, not aimed, but used as a tool. In a single, swift arc, the heavy steel barrel of Eli's pistol crashed against the side of Brody's wrist. A sickening crack echoed through the saloon, followed by Brody's howl of agony. His gun hand fell limp, the bones shattered. Simultaneously, the man to Brody's right, who had begun to draw his own weapon, found his world turned upside down. Eli pivoted, his left hand shooting out to grab the man's gun arm, twisting it violently while his right foot swept the man's legs from under him. The thug hit the floor with a heavy thud, his pistol clattering uselessly across the room. The third man froze, his hand hovering over his holster, his eyes wide with shock and fear at the sudden, brutal display of skill. All of this happened in less than 3 seconds. The tense standoff had exploded into decisive, one-sided violence. Across the room, Sheriff Miller felt the jolt as if electricity had surged through the floor. He had watched, paralyzed, as the confrontation escalated. He saw Brody's move, saw the glint of murderous intent in his eyes. For years, that look had been enough to cow Miller into submission. But seeing Marshal Vance move, seeing the calm, professional ferocity that backed up his authority, stirred something long dormant within the sheriff. It was the ghost of the man he used to be, the man who first pinned on a badge believing it stood for something. His hand, trembling slightly, fell to the butt of his own revolver. The choice was stark: do nothing and remain Brody's puppet, or act and reclaim a piece of his soul. With a guttural yell that was more frustration than courage, Sheriff Miller drew his weapon. He didn't point it at the marshal. He leveled it squarely at Brody's remaining man. "Don't even think about it, Jeb." Miller's voice was raspy, unfamiliar even to himself. "It's over." The man named Jeb, seeing his boss writhing in pain, his partner on the floor, and now the town's own sheriff pointing a gun at him, slowly raised his hands in surrender. The fight was gone, extinguished by the marshal's impossible speed and the sheriff's unexpected betrayal. Eli holstered his pistol, his breathing even, his expression unchanged. He stepped over the groaning man on the floor and looked at the sheriff, whose gun was still shaking. For a moment, their eyes met across the wreckage of Brody's reign. Eli gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. It wasn't praise, but it was an acknowledgement, an acceptance. The standoff was over. The real work was just beginning. The explosion of violence subsided as quickly as it had begun, leaving a thick, ringing silence in its wake. The air in the dusty Spur saloon was heavy with the smell of spilled whiskey, sweat, and the sharp, metallic tang of fear. Brody lay on the floorboards, cradling his shattered wrist and groaning through clenched teeth, his face a mask of disbelief and agony. Beside him, his other man was unconscious, a dark bruise already forming on his jaw. The third, Hank, stood frozen, Sheriff Miller's pistol aimed squarely at his chest, his eyes wide with shock. Marshal Eli Vance didn't waste a moment. His movements were economical, devoid of any theatricality. He stepped over to Hank, plucked the man's pistol from its holster with a swift, practiced motion, and tucked it into his own belt. "Sheriff," Eli's voice was calm, but carried an authority that cut through the tension like a razor. "Cuffs." Miller flinched, as if waking from a long dream. For a beat, he just stared, the weight of his decision of the drawn gun in his hand, pressing down on him. He looked at Hank, a man he'd shared drinks with, a man who represented the comfortable, corrupt peace he had maintained for years. Then he looked at the marshal, whose cold, gray eyes offered no comfort, only expectation. Swallowing hard, Miller holstered his weapon and fumbled at his belt, producing a set of iron cuffs. His hands trembled slightly as he roughly clamped them onto Hank's wrists, the metallic click echoing in the dead quiet saloon. "Now him," Eli said, nodding toward Brody on the floor. Brody glared up at Miller, his eyes burning with a hateful fire. "Miller, you spineless coward," he spat, venom dripping from every word. "You'll hang for this. I own this town." "I own you?" Every patron in the saloon held their breath, watching the sheriff. This was the true test. Cuffling Hank was one thing, putting irons on Blackjack Brody himself was another. Miller's face was pale, a sheen of sweat on his brow. He hesitated, Brody's threats echoing the fears he'd lived with for years. Eli watched him, his expression unreadable, letting the moment hang. He needed to know if Miller's resolve was real or just a fleeting reaction to violence. Finally, with a deep, shuddering breath, Miller knelt down. He ignored Brody's curses, grabbing the cattle baron's good arm and forcing it behind his back with surprising strength. He cuffed him tightly, the iron biting into Brody's flesh. As Miller stood up, he met Eli's gaze. There was still fear in his eyes, but it was now mingled with a flicker of something else: resolve. "Get them on their feet," Eli commanded. "We're moving them to your office." The patrons began to stir, muttering amongst themselves. Sarah, the bartender, leaned against the counter, her arms crossed as she watched the scene unfold with a guarded, almost hopeful expression. A few men started to quietly slip out the back, not wanting to be associated with what was happening. Others stayed, morbidly fascinated by the collapse of the town's long-standing tyrant. With Miller's help, Eli hauled the groaning Brody to his feet. The walk from the saloon to the sheriff's office was the longest 50 yards of Miller's life. As they pushed through the swinging doors, the harsh afternoon sun seemed to put them on a stage. People on the street stopped dead, their eyes widening in disbelief. A hush fell over Redemption Gulch as they saw Blackjack Brody, the untouchable cattle king, being frog-marched down the main street in cuffs by the town's once complacent sheriff and a dusty stranger. The message was clear and devastating. The old order was broken. For the first time in years, the law in Redemption Gulch had teeth, and they had just bitten down hard. The heavy iron door of the cell clanged shut with a sound of finality that echoed in the dusty sheriff's office. The small space, long neglected, smelled of stale coffee, old paper, and the fresh, sharp scent of fear. Blackjack Brody, his face a mask of purple fury and his wrist crudely splinted, glared through the bars. His two henchmen were crammed into the adjacent cell, nursing their own wounds in sullen silence. Marshal Eli Vance ignored them completely. He walked over to Sheriff Miller's desk, which was cluttered with yellowed posters and forgotten paperwork, and swept a small area clean with the side of his hand. He pulled up a rickety wooden chair, the legs groaning in protest, and sat down opposite the sheriff. He didn't look at the cells. His focus was entirely on the man who wore the town's badge. "He's not just a bully, Sheriff," Vance began, his voice low and even, cutting through the tense quiet. "For the last 6 months, I've been tracking a rustling operation that moves stolen cattle across 3 state lines. The trail kept leading back here, to Redemption Gulch." To him, Miller swallowed hard, his eyes darting from the marshal to the caged monster in the corner of his office. I suspected, heard whispers, but Brody owns half the valley. The other half is too scared of him to talk. Fear is his primary currency," Vance agreed, nodding slowly. "But he can't run an operation that big alone. He needs partners. Men who handle the branding, men who forge the bills of sale, men who pay off the railroad agents. I need names, Sheriff. Names you've heard, men who suddenly have more coin than they should, men who ride out at night when they have no business doing so." From his cell, Brody laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "You hear that, Miller? The great federal marshal needs help from a yellow-bellied coward. You won't say a thing. You know what I'll do to you and this whole rotten town when my lawyers get here." Miller flinched, the old fear coiling in his gut. But then he looked at Vance. The marshal's gaze was steady, not judging, but waiting. It was an offer, a chance to finally do the job he'd sworn an oath to do. He took a deep, shuddering breath, the air filling his lungs with a resolve he hadn't felt in years. "Jedediah Smith," Miller said, his voice gaining strength with each word. "He runs the livery. I've seen men ride in on good horses and leave on Brody's stock, no questions asked. And there's a clerk at the land office, a man named Peters. A few months ago, the Callahans lost their farm to Brody over a debt they swore they'd paid. Peters was the one who filed the deed transfer. He bought a new suit the next day." As Miller spoke, Vance listened intently, committing every detail to memory. He was testing the sheriff, seeing if the man's backbone, so recently discovered, would hold firm. Brody's threats from the cell grew louder, more profane, but Miller ignored them, his focus locked on the Marshal. He was unburdening himself of years of silent complicity. "There's more," Miller said, standing up. He walked over to a loose floorboard near the back wall, one he'd made sure squeaked just so. He pried it up and pulled out a small, leather-bound ledger. Dust puffed from its cover as he placed it on the desk in front of Vance. "I started keeping notes. Times, dates, names, things that didn't add up. I told myself it was for, well, I don't know what for. Protection maybe, now I do." Vance opened the book. Inside, in Miller's neat, careful script, was a detailed account of Brody's shadow empire. It was all there. Suspicious cattle sales, land grabs, eyewitness accounts from people too terrified to speak publicly. It was the key to dismantling everything Brody had built. A flicker of respect, the first genuine sign of it, showed in the Marshal's eyes. He looked up from the ledger, first at Miller, then toward the cell. "Looks like your lawyers are going to be busy for a very long time, Brody." Suddenly, from outside, came the sound of a horse galloping away from town at a frantic pace. The sound faded quickly into the night. Someone was sending a message. The news of Blackjack Brody's fall was spreading, and his allies would not remain idle for long. The fight for Redemption Gulch was only just beginning. The sun bled across the horizon, painting the dusty streets of Redemption Gulch in shades of orange and deep purple. Inside the sheriff's office, the air was thick with the scent of gun oil and stale coffee. Marshal Vance stood by the window, a Winchester rifle resting comfortably in his arms, his gaze fixed on the approaching twilight. Sheriff Miller, positioned near the reinforced oak door, checked the cylinders of his Colt for the third time. The silence between them wasn't awkward. It was the quiet understanding of men who knew a storm was coming. "Jedediah Smith," Miller said, his voice a low rumble. "He's Brody's right hand, loyal but not smart. He'll come straight at us, thinking loudness is the same as strength." "Men like that are predictable," Vance replied without turning. "They mistake fear for respect. When the fear is gone, all they have left is bluster." As if summoned by his name, the thud of hoofbeats echoed from the end of Main Street. A group of 5 riders, led by a broad-shouldered man with a wild beard, stopped 30 yards from the jailhouse. The town, which had been tentatively coming back to life, fell silent once more. Doors bolted and windows were shuttered. Jedediah Smith dismounted, his spurs jingling with menace. "Miller," he bellowed, his voice raw with anger. "You send Brody out right now. You and whatever tin star drifter you're hiding behind." The door creaked open, but it was Miller alone who stepped onto the porch, his shotgun held at a casual but ready angle. The last vestiges of the timid, beaten-down man were gone, replaced by a lawman who had finally found his spine. "Blackjack Brody is a federal prisoner, Jedediah," Miller's voice rang out, clear and steady. "He's not going anywhere but to trial. I suggest you and your friends ride on before you join him." Smith let out a guttural laugh. "You've grown a tongue, old man. That's the last mistake you'll ever make." He drew his pistol, and the world erupted in chaos. But Vance and Miller were ready. As Smith raised his gun, a shot cracked from the sheriff's window. Smith cried out, his pistol clattering to the ground as he clutched a bleeding shoulder. He had underestimated the Tin Star drifter. 2 of his men charged the porch, firing wildly. Miller stood his ground, unleashing a blast from his shotgun that sent one man sprawling backward into the dust. The other hesitated, his face a mask of shock, just long enough for Miller to rack the slide and fire again. From the window, Vance's Winchester barked twice more with lethal precision, dropping the remaining gunmen before they could find cover. The entire confrontation lasted less than a minute. The sudden, shocking violence was followed by an even more profound silence. From his cell, Brody screamed in impotent rage, his threats muffled by the thick stone walls. Jedediah Smith lay groaning in the street, his short-lived rebellion over. Slowly, doors began to open. The townspeople emerged, their eyes wide, not with fear, but with a dawning sense of awe. They saw Sheriff Miller standing tall on the porch, smoke curling from his shotgun, a figure of authority they hadn't seen in years. He was their sheriff again. 2 days later, a federal wagon rumbled in front of the jail. Vance led a shackled Brody, followed by a cuffed Jedediah Smith and the other survivors of the shootout. Brody's eyes were filled with a dark, simmering hatred, but his power was broken, his empire reduced to a ledger of crimes and a long ride to a federal penitentiary. As the prisoners were loaded, Vance turned to Miller, extending a hand. "You did good, Sheriff. Redemption Gulch is in capable hands." Miller gripped his hand firmly, a flicker of pride in his tired eyes. "Just doing my job, Marshal. It's about time someone did around here." Marshal Eli Vance mounted his horse, giving a final nod to the man he had inadvertently forced into becoming a hero. As he rode out, escorting the end of an era of corruption, he glanced back at the town. The people were watching him go, but their gazes soon shifted to Sheriff Miller, who now stood alone on the jailhouse steps, a guardian watching over a town that was, for the first time in a long time, truly free.